we're 30 seconds early.
Well, it'll take that long to get it going.
He's getting ready to start.
Go.
Good evening. Welcome to the Little Rock Church of Christ. We'll get everybody in their seats. We have folk enjoying talking to each other. That's not all bad, but it's time to get started. We appreciate those who are tuning in online, and glad to have you with us tonight. We're studying in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, and Paul is talking about paying preachers, and that was a problem there at Corinth. Ironically, they were evidently not having that big a problem paying some of the false teachers, but they were having a problem paying Paul, and accusing Paul of preaching for money, judging his motives, and so he just backed away from it because of false teachers, as we'll see. And we talked about that principle that I think brethren have not done a very good job of studying. Well, probably the preachers are as much at fault as anything. They are maybe afraid of what Paul endured, judging motives, and that is not uncommon when preachers begin to preach what the Bible says on the subject. I can speak from experience, and most preachers can. But it should not stop us from teaching the truth. We declare the whole counsel of God regardless of the consequences, and I think failure to teach on the subject has hurt the church significantly. And we see some really bad misunderstandings. I think it's because of a lack of teaching. I don't think it's rebellion, usually. Or covetousness, which may be a part of it, but it's primarily a lack of teaching. My brethren, in my experience, once they learn and see what it says, respond just very courageously and as they should. We were talking about 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 9, and that which was written in the law. There are those who say, well, wait a minute, this was the old law, so that doesn't pertain to today. If we're trying to learn the plan of salvation, that would be a good comment. But it's a bad comment most of the time, because that was written for our learning and our admonition, and there are all kinds of lessons that we miss because we've really worked hard trying to teach our denominational friends you can't learn how to go to heaven with the Old Testament, to the point that we just don't worry about the Old Testament. We don't study the Old Testament. And that's not what God intended. This was a schoolmaster to bring us to Christ. How are we going to get there? Well, they're just things that you cannot know unless you understand the Old Testament when you study the New. What is a sacrifice? Well, if you don't know what was going on in the Old Testament, there's no way you can understand what Christ was doing on the cross. It won't make sense, and people look at it and they say, I don't understand how that doesn't make any sense. What does the death of a carpenter 2,000 years ago have to do with my sins today? Well, if they'd studied the Old Testament, they'd have a whole lot more insight into that. He refers to the old law, and we looked last time at what the old law taught, or at least a portion of it. And the attitude of the prophets toward the people when they did not pay the priests. And then Paul is referring to the paying of the priest and says it's like paying the preacher today, or elders who labor in the word, those who labor in the word, who teach the word. Jesus himself, Paul says, has ordained. They get their living from the gospel, like the Levites, the priests who taught under the Old Testament and received the prophets' anger, God's anger through the prophets, as they did not take care of them, and the work of the Lord was neglected then. And I see the same thing happening today for the same reasons, and we need to go back and see what God's attitude toward that is. And Paul says we can learn it when we look at the Old Testament. 3 times here in chapter 9 he refers back to the law, in verse 8 and verse 9 and verse 13. He mentions the law of Moses, which says, do not muzzle the ox while he's threshing. That is, he needs to be fed and participate as a result of the work that he's doing. But then Paul makes application that's different from the way a lot of people see it. He says he's not talking about the oxen. Well, the ox is to eat while he's threshing, but that's not what Paul is talking about here. Well, it kind of looks like that's what. No. If that's what you're seeing, you're missing it. Is he speaking altogether? Is he not talking about the oxen? Not concerned about it? Is he, and not that he's not concerned, but that's not what this is about. He's speaking altogether for our sakes. For our sake, it was written. He's talking about the one who might try to muzzle the ox. He has the responsibility to feed that ox. And the application, of course, here toward those who are teaching the word is that the congregation has the obligation to pay wages to the one who's preaching. Now, some were having trouble with that. He said, we sow spiritual, we reap physical. Is that inappropriate? He said, no, that's the way it should work. Same passage is referred to again by Paul in 1 Timothy 5. You'll not muzzle the ox while he's threshing. And then the other part of that section of the Old Testament, the laborer is worthy of his wages, in the context of paying preachers and elders who labor in the word. It's a different subject, but close enough that I can just make a comment. Paying elders is, how many of you know of elders that are being paid by the church? Okay. I know a few. I see a few hands. It's rare as hen's teeth. It's just, and that's not the way we're trying to restore New Testament Christianity. This wasn't rare in New Testament times. Various factors involved there, but I just mentioned that in passing. It deserves more. But here he says the laborer is worthy of his wages. Now, there are a lot of people today who don't understand that preachers are to be paid wages. That's exactly what Paul said. And part of it is the concessions that Paul had to make while he was there at Corinth. It was unique to Corinth. He continued to be paid by other churches while he was at Corinth. Even though he wasn't preaching for them, they still paid him. And he commented about the inappropriateness of that. Inappropriate in that he was serving a congregation that wasn't paying him. And he wasn't going to take money from them because of the false teachers there and the consequences that would come from it. He just would give up his right rather than to encourage the false teachers. And so when people say, well, we're going to follow that example, well, what false teachers are you trying to help here? That's usually not what they're talking about. The term translated wages here is interesting. Thayer says it means dues paid for work, wages higher. In other words, there's an element of debt involved from working that is owed by the one who's the beneficiary of the work. The wages of sin is debt. That's owed, that's earned, and is paid as that which is due. Reward used of the fruit naturally resulting from toils and endeavors is Thayer's definition of this term. Paul says, so there are wages that are due. Looking at Bedag's definition of that same term as payment for work done, the recompense given to the man who works. His wages are considered not a favor, but what is due, and then refers to Romans 4:4, which talks about the wages of sin. That's what Paul says is due, and that's what he's talking about when he said, wait a minute, he's not talking about the ox. He's talking about you. You owe wages. And if you're not paying wages, you're not paying what is due. Back in Jeremiah, we see several, well, not just Jeremiah, several places. This is one example. Woe to him who builds his house without righteousness, and upon his upper rooms without justice, who uses his neighbor's services without pay and does not give him his wages. That was not unusual even in Jesus' time, who talked about those who would not pay wages. James talks about it. Behold, the pay of the laborers who mowed your fields and which has been withheld. That's the term defrauded, which is an interesting term. We won't take time to go into it, but that it certainly indicates this is sinful. It cries out against you. The outcry of those who did the harvesting had reached the ears of the Lord of Sabbath. God takes notice of the fact that that which is due, owed, is not paid. And the ones receiving the wages, usually the ones who are a lesser status in society, the ones who pay, are usually the wealthier. God hears those who cry out and say, wait a minute, this one of higher estate is not paying us of lesser estate. In Philippians 4, Paul gives further information about what was happening there at Corinth. You sent a gift more than once for my needs. They were paying Paul, not that I seek for the gift itself, but I seek for the profit which increases to your account. Again, it's not Paul's demanding that you help him. That's appropriate. That is, he is to teach them that, and did. But the other side of that is a profit to the one who does the paying. You pay the preacher, you participate in the reward of the preacher. Your fellow workers with him. And this is one of the benefits of what is being paid. In 2 John 9, that point is developed when a phrase that we see several times with regard to paying the preacher is mentioned, set them on their way. And we'll look at the definition of that next after this verse. They've testified to your love before the church. You will do well to send them on their way in a manner worthy of Christ. Therefore, we ought to support such men. And the parallelism there helps define what he means by sending them on their way, so that we may be fellow workers with truth. The ones who do that participate in the work that the preacher does. Sending them on their way, they work together. They're fellow workers. That's the way God sees it. Looking at this phrase, to send on my way, to assist someone in making a journey, to send one on one's way with food, with money. This is to support. And it is seen in 1 Corinthians 16. One of the difficulties in understanding Paul, Peter said things hard to understand. One of the difficulties is Paul's thoughts are huge, and his sentences just go on and on and on and on, and the connections sometimes are chopped up to make it more like English. But Ephesians chapter 1 is one sentence. Here it gets chopped up because the first part is talking about the collection for the saints in Jerusalem. Concerning the collection, I have directed the churches, so do you. This is to carry your gift to Jerusalem. Verse 4 continues, doesn't it? And so that you may send me on my way. This is the same word we were just looking at. And then verse 10 continues. It's still the same sentence going on. Now, if Timothy comes, send him on his way. So the and connects this with paying the preacher. It's not just benevolence in 1 Corinthians 16. And sometimes people will say, well, that was all about just helping the saints. It's not about evangelism. Well, they need to go back and look at that chapter. And especially as you look at that word, as we just saw from 3 John, this is about paying those who are preaching, and you become fellow workers with them when you do. Send me on my way wherever I go, Paul says, and then Timothy is to be sent on his way. In Titus 3, we have the same word, and it's one word translated, sent on my way. Diligently help Zenos, the lawyer, and Apollos on their way, so that nothing is lacking for them. In Romans 15, again, whenever I go to Spain, I hope to see you in passing and to be helped on my way there by you. Money is to be given so that you be a fellow worker with them. So this, Paul commends and recommends and instructs, directed the churches, so also do you, to do this. And said there in 1 Corinthians 9, God, that the Lord commanded. It's a military word, a charge. Those who preach the gospel, that they're living in the gospel. And here we see Paul doing that. However, here in 1 Corinthians, he said, did I commit a sin, humbling myself, so that you might be exalted because I preached the gospel to you without charge? And that's different from what he had directed and what he had instructed them to do, what the Lord commanded. He says, nevertheless, we did not use this right, but we endure all things so that we may cause no hindrance to the gospel of Christ. And specifically, when you get to 2 Corinthians, he explains, what I'm doing, I will continue to do so that I may cut off opportunity from those who desire an opportunity to be regarded just as we are in the manner about which they're boasting. They're apostles like Paul was. For such men are false apostles, deceitful workers. This is why he did not take money from the church that he was serving. He did take money while he was there at Corinth from other churches, but he didn't from them because of the false teachers. And those who seek to follow that example today are putting themselves in the category with the false teachers, causing a problem that is similar to what Paul was having here. In 2 Corinthians 11, verse 7, did I commit sin, humbling myself? I preached without charge. Then in the next verse, I robbed other churches by taking wages from them to serve you. In other words, the church of Corinth owed But he didn't take money from them because of the false teachers. He took money from other churches that didn't owe because they weren't the recipient of the labor. And so he robbed them. They didn't owe it. But he took that so that he could continue to serve. The word translated robbed means to strip off the arms of a slain enemy. To strip, be robbed, deprive of a thing, to strip bare, to pillage, to plunder. This was not appropriate, but he robbed other churches, taking money that should have been paid at Corinth from others in order for him to have wages which was owed by the church at Corinth, paid by other churches. He says in verse 9, when I was present with you, and in need, I was not a burden to you, for when the brethren came from Macedonia, they fully supported my need. Now, he was present with the church where? In Corinth. But the brethren came from Macedonia, and they paid him. In everything, I kept myself from being a burden to you because of the false teachers, but was supported with wages from Macedonia, specifically mentioned here. The result, when we go back to what was happening in Acts, describing this, verse 5 of chapter 18, when Paul and Silas came down from Macedonia, Paul began devoting himself completely to the Word. Well, see, he couldn't do that. He was making tents in order to make ends meet, not being supported by the church at Corinth. But when they came from Macedonia, which is what he mentioned in 2 Corinthians, then he could devote himself completely to the Word and didn't have to make tents. Now, think of those implications. Here's the Apostle Paul. Wow, you got the opportunity to have him preaching full time, helping the brethren, teaching the brethren, newly converted, dealing with the problems that were abundant. No, I got to go make tents. Just leave this really critical work, at least for half of the day or half of its time. So take it away from the important work of preaching the gospel and go make tents. Now, he was willing to do that in order to get the job done. That was what was practical there at Corinth because of the false teachers, but it's not what ought to have been done. And it's shameful. And it's being repeated in far too many places today. Now, it's interesting to look at the two different ways Paul spoke of this in 1 Corinthians and in 2 Corinthians. There were some serious problems, just one after another in 1 Corinthians that he dealt with. And you know what? He just, like bowling pins, he knocked them over and fixed them. This one after another, he fixed this problem and fixed that problem. The gross immorality, the fellow repented. Then he had another problem, getting them to forgive, and he fixed that problem in the 2 Corinthians. But 2 Corinthians is a step down the road. It's a step ahead, usually. And we see that when he's dealing with this issue. 1 Corinthians is about, no, we're not going to take money from you. We don't want to encourage these false teachers or fuel their objections. He's dealing with it differently and speaking of it differently in 2 Corinthians. Verse 13 of chapter 12, for in what respect were you treated as inferior to the rest of the churches? Now they were. They didn't get to participate in the gospel like others did, except that I myself did not become a burden to you. Forgive me this wrong. And that's not the way he described it in 1 Corinthians, because he was still working with the problem. Evidently, now then, it's not as much of a problem. He can deal with it more forthrightly at this point. I can refer you to half a dozen places where well-meaning men today and in the past have worked, and they decided they were going to work half-time and preach half-time, so they didn't have to take money for preaching. A little reluctant to take money for preaching. They didn't understand the principles that we've been talking about, the debt and the wage principle, and the Old Testament, which showed God's disfavor when they didn't pay and pay generously. And the church was taught they don't really have to pay the preacher, and if he's a really good preacher, then he won't want money. And so now then, they're in a different situation, and they need a preacher, and they don't know how to pay, and they have that same attitude. Preachers mean well and made sacrifices, but they hurt churches with that example. And there have been times, well, I think it's the responsibility of the preacher. If he wants to sacrifice, great, that's certainly commendable, but don't deprive the church of the opportunity to be fellow workers, and don't teach by example the opposite of what the principle is that brought us to Christ taught us and what Paul is teaching here. Teach the church to pay as it ought to pay, and then turn around and do all the sacrificing you want. But don't hinder the cause of Christ by setting, for example, encouraging churches not to meet their responsibilities and deprive them of the opportunity to participate, as Paul says here. I think that's a thought some haven't thought that they need to think about. And I see that happening to the detriment of the church. Anybody got comments or questions here? Yes.
I think there is an underlying problem that prevents evangelists from being paid in the way they should, the amount that they should be paid. And you said that the Apostle Paul fixed the giving problem at Corinth, but that is the underlying problem that we have today. At best, individual members don't understand, and at worst, they don't care about how much they should give. All too often, they give from how much money is left at the end of the month. And if there's not any money left at the end of the month, then they don't give anything. There's also something else that's prevalent in the church today, and I know several families that adhere to this. They say that if you help a neighbor, that's as good as giving to the church, as good as giving to God. If you give to a charity, that's as good as giving to God for what you prosper. So all of this takes away from the amount of money in the church treasury that could be paid to the local evangelists and evangelists in other locations. In Malachi, the Israelites were condemned for sacrificing to God the blind, the lame, the dredges of the flocks. And then in chapter 3, he told the Israelites that they had robbed God. And they said, how have you robbed God? Or how have we robbed God? And he said, in tithes and offerings.
No.
So the members need to be educated as to how we should give from what we prosper. And just like it says in 2 Corinthians 9, if we sow bountifully, we'll reap bountifully. If we sow sparingly, we'll reap sparingly. And we're to give from, we're to purpose in our hearts what we're going to give. And we should give from what we prosper. And it should come first. God should always come first, not last, not what's left. And, you know, the old adage is, you know, this is what I have left, I'll throw $1 in the plate. And that is not pleasing to God, and it's a sin. And if the church treasury had more money, the evangelists would, I'm sure the elders would pay the evangelists according to what would be deemed as an adequate living or above adequate living, and then be able to have more evangelists around the state, around the country, around the world.
You know how many times I've heard that from somebody that's not a preacher? Not many. I appreciate it. Sometimes we get immune to hearing it from preachers because we judge motives.
One other thing, and I made this comment when I was before the congregation a few weeks ago when it was time to talk about the offering. But I can't remember the last time I heard a sermon to the congregation about how giving should be done. You know, periodically back in the olden days when I was a young man, we'd hear preach a sermon on giving occasionally. Not real often, because every time the sermon was preached on giving, somebody got mad. Because you know, you're stepping on somebody's toes, and the one that wasn't giving the way that according to what they prospered, were usually the ones that got mad. So you know, maybe it's time to start preaching on giving again, and letting people understand, or helping people understand what giving according to what you prospered means.
I appreciate the comments, and we had a series, I think it was 4 lessons on Sunday nights here, but it's been 2 years. And that's not enough, especially when we see the idea of I gave to the Salvation Army, therefore, is one of dozens of screwball ideas. I mean, more screwball ideas that I hear on the subject of giving than maybe any other. I think it's preachers' fault that they're we don't do.
You need to preach.
The fact that we've got always praising just obviously wrong. That is because we're not doing the teaching that we need to teach on it. And yeah, there'll be some that'll go off in a huff. But we have to teach the whole counsel of God regardless, not shun to declare. But you're right. And I repent of not having done it more, and I ask for forgiveness, and we'll try to do better. And it's easier to do better when we have comments like that. And that's rare. Too rare, as well as sermons too rare. Might mention one more passage before we get off this subject, one in 1 Timothy 5, speaking of elders directly, but more generally those who work hard at preaching and teaching. They're worthy of double honor. And then he uses the term wages that we saw a moment ago in verse 18. When we preached on that subject a while back, we pointed out that You just look up the word, it's talking about paying. And paying double, ooh. You talk about, well, it's just not done. It's not even average, usually, often. Brethren are doing a lot better. And in many places are doing well. Many places doing as well as they can. But the idea of paying double, well, and the point, the people, the work of preaching the gospel is the greatest work in the world, and we ought to reflect that in our attitudes. It's almost the opposite. Receiving money from paying is shameful, not double honor. And attitudes are, if we want to restore New Testament Christianity, we need to work on attitudes as well as actions. All right, other comments and questions? Now, when we did the lesson, we documented the fact that that phrase is about paying, about money.
Just one other.
In fact, some of the translations just say it's to be paid double. Yes.
And you're talking about studying the Old Testament, and again, I've never computed this amount myself, but I've heard other preachers say that actually in the Israelites, you hear about them tithing 10%, but the amount that they actually gave with all the sacrifices and offerings that they were commanded to give was really more like 33 1/3%, and not 10%. So, you know, you take what the Israelites had as their reward, and then you compare it to what we have as our reward, and they're giving 33 1/3%, and what are we giving for?
To whom much is given, much is required.
But you know, we have the death, burial, and resurrection of our Savior, and we throw $1 in the plate.
The passage you referred to, you robbed me in tithes, and offerings.
Right.
The passage we looked at last week from the Old Testament, describing what was withheld and then with the prophets rebuked, corrected, described contributions, tithes, and offerings that went to those who labored in the word. Tithes were 10%. That's, whether you prospered or not, that's 10%, period. Then the rest, the contributions, offerings, were in addition to that. So it was obvious. I mean, so many people think, well, if I do 10%, then I'm doing at least what they did in the Old Testament, which is not what Hebrews taught when he says, when you receive more, you owe more. But there was a lot more in the Old Testament than the tithe. A lot more. And most of the contributions and the offerings went to the priest as well as the tithes. The tithes specifically, totally to the priest. But that's not generally known. The general picture is, 10%, I'll do that much. And that's shameful. And it's preacher's fault. So we need to do a better job. Other comments? Yes.
I was a deacon in California, and one of my jobs was going in the mail from the preachers asking for support, and one year we got 110 requests.
Are we listening to that? Listen to that. 110 men.
Usually like 80.
Maybe not all worthy, but if half of them are, you didn't help half of that number.
Our call.
could have helped a whole lot more
Yeah.
if brethren were doing at least as much as they did in the Old Testament, and they should do more.
And that was probably just from the people in the States, wasn't it, Denny? Or was it-
Yeah, yeah.
That didn't
People that
take in,
we had a reputation of supporting a lot of
yeah.
congregations, or a lot of preachers, and I guess the word got out.
But then you take in the request from, I mean, the brethren in Africa, they're always, I mean, I don't know how many, faithful preachers there are in Africa that just starve. The whole country's starving, and they're begging for support all the time. They need it. And they're faithful evangelists.
When we have emergencies like famines there, and we know the circumstance, and we have people there that can tell us dependably, you know what happens? It's thrilling to see brethren respond. Generally, they just have, in fact, when they had the hurricanes down in Texas too long ago, several of the churches had to say, wait a minute, we got plenty. We don't need it. I know of several, and we were told that by someone, sent the money back. We got more than they need. That's when they need food, water. What about when they need the gospel? Well, we respond to needs. Oh, wait a minute. Souls are dying without the gospel. That's not a need? What are we thinking? Not a need. I see generous response, wonderful, but we need to respond to the request for needs. There's not a church anywhere, a faithful church, that's not getting requests for those who need to be helped. We've got about another 5 minutes here. Let me take time to tell another story that I've told before. I'm going to tell it again. It had an impact on my thinking and attitudes. I wish you could have shared it. In a very, fairly unusual circumstance, I was doing a creation seminar in I don't like labels. If we put a label on it, we'd probably say considerable. And that's on the edge. They had big congregation, probably 450 people there. And they did have a church school right next to, not church school, they had a school right next to the building. They said it was separated, it was supported by individuals, but it didn't look that way. And then there were some other questionable things. They did not practice sponsoring church arrangement. And they weren't sending to institutions, but half of them thought it was all right. So it was a not real faithful group, as we use that term, maybe inappropriately. I was asked to come do a seminar. I wasn't so sure. There was a very faithful congregation there in that town. This is San Marcos, I believe, Texas. They were maybe 50. And I thought, well, I need to know more about this situation. So I called the preacher there, and I had known him, didn't know him well. He said, I'm studying with this preacher at the big group, and we're making progress, and he's got a good attitude. And he says, I think it would be great if you came and taught them about creation and have more confidence in the scriptures, and we'll be there and listen. So with that understanding, I went ahead and agreed to do the seminar. Well, I think we helped, and they appreciated the lessons, but they taught me because I saw them in preparation for something that was a very, very exciting part of their work there. The fifth Sunday, doesn't come around all the time, was totally devoted to evangelism around the world. And the elders built up the excitement, the anticipation. And so when, they were running 4,000 to 5,000 contribution on a regular Sunday. On fifth Sunday, it was 75 to 80,000. Now, that doesn't happen without some teaching and without some people interested in the need of preaching the gospel. One of the ways the elders there built that was that the churches that were being helped, they brought the men in and spoke to the congregation. They had families that would go and spend a week or 2 weeks in the Caribbean, in the Ukraine, in Russia, in various places around, and they would come back and tell the congregation, stand up with tears in their eyes and say, here's the need. Now those elders were promoting and selling the need to preach the gospel, and the members were responding. Sometimes we hear the, I think, foolish objection. Yeah, we may not be doing it right, but at least we're doing it when we're talking about cooperation and preaching the gospel. There's more truth to that than I'm comfortable with. When I look at that situation and I see, yeah, we got a need, and if somebody's hungry, but the need of lost souls, I don't see the appreciation that we ought to have. And speaking of there not being a need, just grates on me. And I think of the brethren there in San Marcos who were really getting that job done. I think that's the way it was in New Testament times. They were sending them on their way, and they were making sure they were there, and they got all those letters requesting for help. They were answering those letters. We can't do that today. All right, that's 6 minutes, not 5. We thank you for your attention this evening. We'll continue with 1 Corinthians chapter 9, as Paul continues to talk about, not that subject, but the subject of considering the implications of your action on the weaker brethren and becoming all things to all men. And I should be here for the next Wednesday evening.
Sing on, joyful.